The final assault began at dawn on the 7th day of the battle, and High Sentinel Krex committed every remaining Vothari warrior to one desperate push against the human defensive lines because he knew there would be no second chance. 3,000 Vothari troops advanced across the red plains of Kessler 9, and their armor gleamed in the morning sun, and they moved with the precision that came from decades of military training and conquest. But these warriors were no longer the confident conquerors who had arrived a week earlier, and they had seen too many of their comrades die to human weapons and human cunning, and they knew they were marching toward Death. Commander Chen watched the advancing army from her mobile command post, and she felt exhaustion pulling at her bones, but also a fierce determination that carried her through. All units hold your positions until they reach the primary kill zone, Chen ordered, and around the outpost perimeter her defenders made final checks of their weapons and ammunition. Lieutenant Park stood with his squad in a reinforced bunker that overlooked the main approach route, and he had been fighting for 7 days with minimal sleep, and his hands shook from fatigue and adrenaline. "Here they come," Park said quietly, and his people settled into their firing positions and waited for the order. Vothari reached the markers that designated the kill zone, and that was when the humans opened fire with everything they had left: heavy machine guns and plasma weapons and modified mining lasers. All spoke at once, and the sound was like the end of the world, and the first ranks of Vothari fell like wheat before a scythe. But the aliens kept coming, and they returned fire with their energy weapons, and the air filled with death and destruction, and both sides, committed to the final confrontation, the Vothari crashed into the human defensive lines, and the battle became brutal. Close-quarters combat where size and strength mattered as much as skill and courage. Private Santos fought hand-to-hand with a Vothari warrior who was nearly twice her size, and she used her smaller stature to duck under his strikes, and she drove her combat knife into the weak points of his armor around her. The Maver that chin knife into the weak points of his armor, around her. The Versins battle raged, and humans and aliens died together, and the red soil of Kessler 9 turned darker with their blood. Chun made the hardest decision of her life, and she activated the final contingency plan that would ensure victory, but at a terrible cost. All units, this is Commander Chun, she said, and her voice carried across every radio frequency the humans used. Initiate cave collapse protocol Omega, she ordered, and there was a moment of silence as her people understood what this meant. The remaining tunnels and caves that hadn't been collapsed earlier would now be brought down, and this would trap hundreds of human fighters who were still engaging the enemy underground. But it would also ensure that any Vothari who had penetrated the network would die. Sergeant Williams led a squad in the deepest section of the remaining tunnel network, and they had been holding off a Vothari assault force for 3 hours when they heard the commander's order. "Well, that's it then," Williams said to his people, and they all knew what was coming. "We make them pay for every second," he added, and they prepared for their last stand. Charges detonated in sequence, and the tunnel system collapsed section by section, and Williams and his squad fought until the ceiling came down, and then there was only darkness and silence on the surface. The Vothari assault was beginning to break through in several locations, and Chen knew they couldn't hold much longer against the weight of numbers. "Marcus, I need your miracle now," Chen said into her radio, and the engineer responded immediately, activating the reserve railguns. Marcus replied, and he had saved 3 of his orbital weapons in protected positions for exactly this moment. The railguns that everyone thought had been destroyed came online, and they fired not at the ships in orbit, but at the mast. Vothari forces on the ground, the kinetic projectiles, struck with devastating force, and each impact created a crater and a shockwave that killed everything within 100 meters. The Vothari assault formation shattered as warriors scattered, trying to avoid the artillery strikes that came from the sky like the wrath of vengeful gods. Krex watched his final attack collapse, and he knew In that moment that he had lost everything, and his fleet was destroyed, and his army was dying, and there would be no escape. All ships prepare to self-destruct. Krex ordered because he would not allow human hands to capture Vothri technology. Better to die than give these primitives our secrets, he added, and his crew began the activation sequence for the ship's reactor overloads. But the humans had different plans, and teams led by Marcus stormed the damaged warships before the self-destruct could complete. The fighting inside the ships was savage and desperate, and Vothri crew members fought to defend their vessels, but they were outnumbered and outfought. Marcus reached the reactor control room of Krex's flagship, and he shot the Vothri engineer who was trying to trigger the overload, and then he reversed the sequence with seconds to spare. The battlefield, the Vothri resistance was collapsing, and warriors who had fought for days without rest were finally breaking under. The relentless human assault park led a counterattack that pushed the aliens back from the northern perimeter, and his people fought with a fury born of exhaustion and determination and the will to survive. "Keep pushing," Park shouted, and he fired his weapon until the power cell ran dry, and then he picked up a fallen Vothri energy rifle and kept fighting. Battle raged for 6 more hours, and gradually the human forces gained the upper hand, and the Vothri army that had numbered thousands was reduced to hundreds and then to scattered groups trying desperately to find shelter. Chun ordered her forces to hunt down every remaining Vothri warrior, and she knew this seemed harsh, but she also knew that any survivor who escaped could bring reinforcements. "No one leaves this planet," Chun ordered, and her troops acknowledged and began the grim work of eliminating the remaining enemy forces. Over the next 3 days, human search teams scoured the outpost and the surrounding terrain for Vothri survivors, and they found them hiding in caves and damaged buildings and the wreckage of their own ships. Each encounter ended the same way with the Vothri, either fighting to the death or being killed when they tried to surrender. Because Chun had given strict orders, she took no pleasure in this decision, but she understood that Kessler 9 was too far from Earth for regular patrols, and if even one Vothri escaped, he could guide a larger invasion force back. The crashed warship in the northern continent was the last place they searched, and rescue teams found survivors in the wreckage. Broadcasting distress calls, Chun led the team personally, and they fought through the damaged corridors, eliminating resistance until they reached the command section, where the senior surviving Vothri officer waited. Alien officer was badly injured, but still armed, and he looked at Chen with something like respect in his eyes. "You fought well, human," the officer said in broken but understandable English. "Your people will remember what happened here," Chen replied, and she raised her weapon. "They will learn not to threaten humanity," she added, and then she fired. The last Vothri on Kessler 9 died 3 days and 14 hours after the final assault began, and with his death, the invasion ended. Chun stood in what remained of the outpost's central plaza and looked at the devastation that surrounded her, and the wreckage of 3 Vothri warships, and the bodies of enemies who had thought humans were easy prey. "Get me casualty reports," Chun ordered, and when the numbers came in, she felt the weight of command settle heavily on her shoulders. 312 humans had died defending Outpost Sentinel 7, and another 200 were wounded, and the outpost itself was heavily damaged. But they had survived, and they had destroyed an entire Vothri invasion force and sent a message that would echo across the galaxy. Marcus approached her with a datapad, and his face was dirty, and his hands were bandaged from the fighting inside the Vothri ships. "We've secured all the alien technology, and I've got teams cataloging everything," Marcus reported. "The knowledge we'll gain from this will advance human understanding by decades," he added, and Chun nodded because at least some good would come from the bloodshed. Park limped up to join them, and his left arm was in a sling, but he was smiling for the first time in days. "The perimeter is secure, Commander, and all remaining Vothri are confirmed eliminated," Park reported. "Good work, Lieutenant," Chun said, And she meant it because her people had performed beyond all expectations. The Earth Navy arrived 3 weeks later, and they expected to find ruins and bodies and perhaps a few traumatized survivors hiding in the wreckage instead. They found a battered but functioning outpost surrounded by the remains of 3 Vothary warships and enough salvaged alien technology to keep Earth scientists busy for years. Admiral Marcus Torres met with Commander Chun in what remained of the command center, and he listened to her report with growing amazement. "You held off an entire invasion fleet with less than 1,000 people," Torres said, and he couldn't quite believe what he was hearing. "We did what we had to do, Admiral," Chun replied simply. "We couldn't run and we wouldn't surrender, so we fought," she added, "and we made certain they regretted attacking us." She finished. Torres looked at the memorial wall where Chun had already placed the names of every human who died defending the outpost, and he felt pride and sorrow in equal measure. "I'll make sure Earth Command knows what happened here," Torres promised. The damaged Vothary warship fell through Kessler 9's atmosphere, trailing debris and plasma fire, and its engines were dead, and its hull was breached in a dozen places, and there was nothing the crew could do but prepare for impact. The ship crashed into the northern continent with the force of a small nuclear weapon, and the impact crater stretched for kilometers, and most of the crew died instantly, but some survived trapped in the wreckage and broadcasting distress signals. High Sentinel Krex watched his warship die and felt fury building inside him, because this should have been a simple operation, and these humans should have been eliminated days ago. "All ships prepare for atmospheric entry," Krex ordered, and he knew this was against every principle of space combat, but he had no choice. "We will land our forces and repair our vessels on the surface, and then we will exterminate every human on this rock," he continued, and his remaining 2 ships began their descent. What Krex didn't know was that the humans had been preparing for exactly this scenario, and Marcus had one more surprise ready. "Commander, the Vothary ships are descending," the sensor operator reported, and Chun smiled grimly because her enemy was doing exactly what she wanted. "Activate the satellite grid," Chun ordered, and across Kessler 9's orbital space dozens of modified mining drones powered up their engines. The drones had been deployed over months, disguised as space debris, and each one carried a small fusion reactor that created a localized gravity distortion field, and individually they were barely noticeable, but together they formed a web that made faster than light travel impossible. The Vothary ships detected the gravity anomalies, and their navigation computers began flashing warnings about jump drive safety, and the ship's captains realized with growing horror that they were trapped. "High Sentinel, we cannot achieve escape velocity," the captain of the 2nd warship reported, and his voice carried barely controlled panic. "The entire system is saturated with gravity wells, and we would need to clear the satellites before we could jump," he added. "Then we proceed as planned," Krex said coldly, because turning back now would mean admitting defeat, and that was something he could not do. The 2 warships descended through the atmosphere, and their shields glowed white-hot from atmospheric friction, and they came down on the flatlands east of the outpost where their sensors showed relatively stable ground. The landing was rough, and both ships sustained additional damage as their hulls groaned under stresses they were never designed to handle. But they made it down intact. Krex stood on the bridge of his flagship and looked out at the alien landscape, and he knew that somewhere out there the humans were preparing their next move. "Deploy all remaining forces," Krex ordered, and the ship's belly opened to disgorge the last of his warriors. 3,000 Vothary troops formed up on the surface, and they represented the last intact fighting force the invasion fleet possessed, and Krex knew that if this assault failed, there would be no rescue inside the command bunker. Chun watched the Vothary ships land, and she felt a fierce satisfaction because her enemy had just made his final mistake. "They've trapped themselves," Park said, and he was coordinating defensive positions through multiple communication channels. Now we make sure they can never leave. Chun replied, and she activated the tactical plan that Marcus had designated as endgame teams of human fighters. Emerged from hidden positions, and they carried captured Vothri weapons and equipment that they had salvaged from earlier battles. Corporal Kim led one such team, and they had spent hours studying Vothri dropship controls, using footage from their helmet cameras and Marcus's technical expertise. Remember, we just need to get it into the air, Kim told his team as they approached a captured dropship that had been damaged but was still functional. We're not trying to win a dogfight, he added, and they climbed aboard the alien vessel. The controls were designed for beings with different proportions, but humans were nothing if not adaptable. And within minutes, Kim had the ship powered up and lifting off. Similar scenes played out around the outpost as human teams commandeered damaged Vothri craft and took to the skies with barely controlled fury. The Vothri ships in orbit and on the ground detected the launches and their point defense systems, tracked the incoming craft and prepared to shoot them down, but the humans weren't attacking conventionally, and each captured dropship was loaded with mining explosives and industrial chemicals that Marcus had turned into devastating improvised weapons. Kim's ship came in fast and low toward one of the landed Vothri warships, and the point defense lasers tore into his hull, but he kept the ship on course through sheer willpower. 4. Sentinel-7, Kim shouted into his radio, and then he rammed his dropship into the Vothri vessel's shield generator array. The explosion was massive, and the Vothri ship's shields flickered and died, and suddenly it was vulnerable to the railgun fire that immediately began hammering its hull. Other human pilots followed Kim's example, and they turned themselves into guided missiles that struck the Vothri ships at their most vulnerable points. Second warship took 3 suicide strikes in rapid succession, and its weapon systems went offline and fires spread through its interior compartments. Launch fighters and cleared these pests. Craig screamed, and he watched his carefully planned invasion collapsing into chaos. The Vothri did launch their remaining fighters, and they were superior craft flown by trained pilots, and they began shooting down the captured dropships with ruthless efficiency. But for every human ship they destroyed, 2 more appeared, and the humans just kept coming with a determination that bordered on insanity. On the ground, the Vothri ground forces began their advance on the outpost, and they moved in perfect formation because they were still disciplined warriors despite everything. Jun watched them come, and she gave the order that would seal the fate of thousands. "Collapse the tunnels," she said, and her voice was heavy with the knowledge of what she was about to. DeMarcus hesitated for just a moment because he knew what this meant, and there were still human fighters in some of those tunnels engaging the enemy. "Do it," Chun repeated, and Marcus entered the activation code throughout the tunnel network. Shaped charges detonated in carefully planned sequences, and millions of tons of rock shifted and fell, and entire sections of the underground labyrinth collapsed in on themselves. Vari warriors who had penetrated deep into the tunnels were buried alive, and they died in darkness and crushing pressure, and their communications cut off mid-scream. Humans died too, and fighters who had volunteered to delay the enemy in the deepest sections knew they wouldn't be coming back. Sergeant Foster was one of those volunteers, and she held her position with her squad as the ceiling began to crack and dust filled the air. "It's been an honor," Foster said to her people, and they responded with affirmative acknowledgments. The tunnel came down and sealed them in with the Vothri they had been fighting, and the last thing Foster did was trigger her remaining explosives to ensure the enemy died with here. On the surface, the ground shook from the tunnel collapses, and the Vothri advance stalled as warriors realized that their comrades in the underground had just been entombed. "Keep moving forward," the Vothri officers shouted. But their troops were no longer the confident conquerors who had arrived days earlier. The humans defending the surface positions fought with desperate courage, and they knew they were buying time for The final phase of the plan Park commanded the northern defense line, and his people held against waves of Vothri attackers who were increasingly frantic to break through before more disaster struck in orbit. The satellite grid continued its work, and the gravity wells prevented any Vothri vessel from escaping the system, and Marcus had designed the satellites to be numerous enough that destroying them all would take days. The Vothri ships on the ground were now the focus of relentless attack, and human fighters using both captured craft and improvised weapons struck at them continuously. Marcus himself led a team carrying the largest mining charge they could transport, and they approached the nearest warship through a network of drainage culverts. "This is going to be loud," Marcus said as they placed the charge against the ship's landing gear support structure. "Set timer for 2 minutes and then we run," he added, and his team worked with practiced efficiency. They made it clear just as the charge detonated, and the explosion severed the landing gear, and the entire warship tilted at a dangerous angle, and internal systems began failing. Krex felt his flagship shudder, and he knew that his position was becoming untenable. And he had lost most of his fleet, and his ground forces were being ground down, and there was no escape from this cursed world. All forces concentrate on taking the human command center, Krex ordered, because if he could kill their leadership, perhaps the resistance would collapse. But Chun had anticipated this, and she had moved her command center 3 times in the last day, and the Vothri were attacking empty bunkers while she coordinated the defense from a mobile position. The battle raged through the night and into the next day, and both sides were exhausted, but the humans had one crucial advantage, which was that they were fighting for their home. The Vothri were fighting because they had been ordered to, and because they feared their commanders more than they feared death. But that was changing as they watched their fellows die in droves. Small groups of Vothri warriors began attempting to surrender, and they threw down their weapons, and the morning of the 3rd day dawned cold and red over. Keslo9 and Commander Thax assembled his remaining forces for what he believed would be the final push to crush the human resistance. Had 1,700 warriors still combat effective after the brutal fighting of the previous days in High Sentinel? Krex had made it abundantly clear that failure to eliminate the humans quickly would result in Thax's own execution. "We advance on all fronts simultaneously," Thax told his officers, and he pointed to the map showing dozens of tunnel entrances spread across the outpost perimeter. "The humans cannot defend everywhere at once, and we will overwhelm them with numbers," he continued, and his officers nodded, though several looked uncertain. What Thax didn't understand was that the humans weren't trying to defend everywhere, and they were fighting a very different kind of war than anything the Vothri had experienced before. Deep in the cave network, Marcus Webb made final adjustments to his masterpiece, and he had spent the last year secretly reverse engineering technology from the crashed alien vessel they had discovered in the southern mountains. The vessel had belonged to a species called Degen, and they had been exploring the sector centuries ago before mysteriously disappearing, and their technology was remarkably compatible with human engineering principles. Marcus had managed to adapt several key systems, including energy shields and plasma weapons, and most importantly, a network of sensors that could track movement through solid rock. "Commander, I'm bringing the new systems online," Marcus reported to Chun, who stood in the central command bunker surrounded by tactical displays. "Do it," Chun said, and she watched as the displays suddenly filled with detailed information about Vothori positions, both on the surface and in the tunnels they had already penetrated. Lieutenant Park stood in tunnel section 7 Alpha with his squad, and they waited in the darkness, listening to the sound of Vothari warriors approaching their position. The aliens moved cautiously now because they had learned that rushing forward in these confined spaces led to death, but caution wouldn't save them from what was coming. "Targets at 50 meters, Park whispered into his headset, and he could see the enemy clearly on the new tactical display that Marcus had installed in his helmet. "Fire on my mark," he continued, and his finger rested on the trigger of a weapon that looked like a mining plasma cutter, but had been heavily modified. The Vothari entered the kill zone, and Park gave the signal, and suddenly the tunnel filled with superheated plasma and devastating energy bursts that cut through alien armor like paper. The Vothari tried to return fire, but the humans had already fallen back through prepared positions and sealed blast doors, and by the time the aliens could regroup, they had lost another 20 warriors all across the tunnel network. Similar ambushes played out, and the Vothari advanced ground to a halt as they encountered resistance that seemed to know exactly where they were and when they were coming. "How are the humans tracking us?" Thax demanded of his technical specialists, who scrambled to scan for sensor emissions. "Unknown, Commander," the lead specialist replied, and his voice carried frustration and fear in equal measure. "They appear to have technology beyond what our intelligence reported," he added, and Thax felt cold dread settling into his bones. In Tunnel Section 12 Beta, Sergeant Foster led her squad in a running battle through a series of natural caves, and they used the terrain to their advantage, ducking behind rock formations and firing from unexpected angles. The Vothari pursuing them were larger and stronger, but the humans were faster and more adaptable, and they knew these caves like the miners. They were because many of them had helped excavate and map this network. Foster's squad led the Vothari deeper into the Vi cave system, and when they reached a particular intersection, she triggered the detonator that brought down supports. Marcus had pre-weakened, and the tunnel collapsed, trapping 50 Vothari warriors in a tomb of stone. "Sector 12 clear," Foster reported, and she allowed herself a grim smile as she led her squad to their next defensive position. The battle continued throughout the day, and the Vothari made minimal progress while suffering casualties that would have broken most military units. But the humans were also paying a price, and Chun watched the casualty reports with a heavy heart as brave men and women died defending their home. Corporal Kim's team held Tunnel Section 4 against repeated assaults, and when they finally ran out of ammunition, they fell back to prepare positions where stockpiles of weapons and explosives waited. "We can keep this up for weeks if we have to," Park told Chun during a brief lull in the fighting. "We won't have to," Chun replied, and she gestured to a different set of displays showing the Vothari ships in orbit. "Marcus has another surprise ready," she added, and Park's eyes widened as he saw what the engineer had planned. Marcus had used components from the alien wreck to build something humanity had only theorized about, which was railgun artillery that could reach orbital targets, and he had hidden the weapons in the mountains, using natural cave formations to mask their energy signatures. "We get one shot at this," Marcus said as he ran final calculations on the targeting computer. "The moment we fire, they'll know where the guns are, and they'll hit us with everything they have," he continued, and Chun nodded because she understood the risk. "Wait until Thax commits his reserves," Chun ordered, and she wanted the maximum number of Vothari warriors on the planet before they made their move. Thax grew increasingly desperate as the day wore on, and his casualties mounted, and his warriors began showing signs of fear, which was something Vothari shock troopers were not supposed to experience. "Commit the orbital reserves," Thax ordered, and he watched as the last 1,000 warriors loaded onto dropships and prepared to reinforce. The ground battle high Sentinel Krex approved the deployment because he was also growing concerned about how this campaign was developing, and a mining outpost should not be able to resist an entire battle group. The dropships launched and began their descent, and that was when Marcus fired his railguns. The weapons used electromagnetic acceleration to launch solid projectiles at a significant fraction of light speed and at orbital ranges. Vothari shields and armor might as well have been paper. The first railgun shot hit a Vothari warship's engine section, and the impact released enough energy to tear the vessel nearly in half, and secondary explosions rippled through its hull as reactor containment failed. The second shot struck a dropship formation, and 3 vessels simply disintegrated in the impact, and the remaining dropships scattered in panic. The third shot missed its target because the Vothry ships were already taking evasive action, but it passed. Close enough to one vessel that the kinetic energy caused hull fractures and system failures aboard his flagship. Krex stared in disbelief at the tactical display, showing one of his warships crippled and falling toward the planet, and he had underestimated these humans catastrophically. Return fire and destroy those weapons. Krex screamed, and his crew scrambled to comply. The Vothry ships opened fire on the mountain positions where the railguns were hidden, and massive energy blast turned rock to molten glass and created new craters on Kessler 9's surface. But Marcus had built the railgun emplacements deep into the mountains with layers of rock providing natural armor, and while some weapons were destroyed, others remained functional. Fire at will, Chun ordered, and Marcus didn't need to be told twice. The railguns spoke again and again, and each shot forced the Vothry ships to maneuver wildly to avoid being hit, and that meant they couldn't maintain stable firing positions on the ground. The Vothry warriors heard the sounds of their ships being attacked, and they felt something they had never experienced before, which was the possibility of being stranded on a hostile world. "Commander, we need to withdraw and regroup," one of Thax's officers said, and there was no shame in his voice, only pragmatic assessment of a deteriorating situation. "We cannot withdraw," Thax replied bitterly, and he knew that Krex would execute him if he retreated without orders. The humans, sensing the change in Vothry morale, began pushing back, and defensive positions became offensive sally points, and suddenly the aliens were being attacked from multiple directions. Park led a counterattack in the northern tunnels, and his people fought with renewed vigor because they could hear the sounds of the orbital battle, and they knew Marcus had given them a chance. "Push them back," Park shouted, and his squad advanced with covering fire and grenades and plasma weapons. The Vothry line in that sector broke, and warriors who had never retreated in their careers found themselves running from humans who seemed to have found a second wind. Chun watched the tactical displays and saw opportunity in the chaos, and she made a decision that would determine the outcome of the entire battle. "All units, this is Commander Chun," she said over the general channel, and every human defender heard her voice. "We're going to attack their command post and kill their ground commander," she announced, and around the tunnel network, her people responded with savage approval. "Lieutenant Park, you have tactical command of the defense," Chun continued, and then she gathered her personal security detail. "We're going hunting," she told them, and they checked their weapons and prepared to take the fight directly to the enemy. The humans emerged from hidden tunnel exits and struck at the Vothry command post with precision, and High Sentinel Krex stared at the tactical display aboard his flagship and frowned because the bombardment should have produced more dramatic results than a few explosions and scattered fires that were already dying out in Kessler 9's thin atmosphere. "Send down the shock troopers," Krex ordered, and he gestured impatiently at his subordinate, who immediately began relaying commands to the dropship base. 2,000 Vothry warriors prepared for deployment, and these were not ordinary soldiers, but genetically enhanced shock troops who had conquered 40 worlds and crushed dozens of primitive species who dared resist the collective's expansion. Each warrior stood nearly 8 feet tall with armored exoskeletons that enhanced their already formidable strength, and they carried weapons capable of cutting through reinforced steel, and they had been trained since birth to kill efficiently and without mercy. The dropships launched in waves, in their hulls glowing as they hit the atmosphere, and they descended toward the human outpost like meteors, bringing death from above. Inside the command bunker, Chun watched the incoming vessels and calmly gave orders to her security teams, who were positioned in carefully prepared defensive locations throughout the outpost. "Wait until they've committed at least half their forces to the ground," Chun said into her communications headset, and her voice was steady despite the adrenaline coursing through her veins. "Let them think they're winning," she added. And around the outpost, human defenders checked their weapons one final time and said quiet prayers and prepared to show these aliens what human desperation looked like. The first dropships landed in the outpost's main plaza and their ramps crashed. Down and Vothori warriors poured out expecting to find terrified Myers hiding in whatever shelter they could find. Instead, they found prepared defensive positions and interlocking fields of fire, and the first volley of human weapons fire caught the Vothori completely by surprise. Private First Class Maria Santos fired her heavy machine gun from a reinforced bunker and watched the armor-piercing rounds slam into the lead Vothori warriors, and they stumbled and fell because their armor could stop most conventional weapons. But humanity had stopped using conventional weapons decades ago. Vothori returned fire with their energy weapons, and the air filled with the smell of ozone and burning metal, and the sound of explosions echoed across the outpost as both sides committed to the fight. Lieutenant Park commanded the defense of the northern sector, and he watched his people fight with pride because every single one of them was performing exactly as trained, and they weren't panicking, and they weren't running, and they were making the aliens pay for every meter of ground. Fall back to secondary positions, Park ordered after his squad had held the initial line for 15 minutes and inflicted heavy casualties on the attacking Vothori. Humans withdrew in good order, and as the Vothori advanced to pursue them, they triggered the first wave of improvised explosive devices that Marcus and his engineering team had spent weeks preparing. The explosions tore through the Vothori ranks and sent bodies flying and created chaos in their previously orderly advance, and for the first time in their military careers, the shock troopers experienced something they had never felt before, which was doubt. More dropships landed and disgorged more warriors, and the battle intensified as the Vothori committed more forces to overcome what should have been token resistance. But the humans weren't offering token resistance, and they were fighting like cornered animals who knew surrender meant death, and they used every trick and tactic they had learned from centuries of human warfare. Corporal David Kim led a small team through the maintenance tunnels and emerged behind a group of Vothori who were advancing toward the medical facility, and his team opened fire at point-blank range, and the aliens never knew what hit them. Mining charges ready, one of Kim's team members said, and they placed the explosive devices that were normally used for breaking rock, but worked just as well for collapsing tunnels on top of enemy soldiers. The humans fought with a ferocity that shocked the Vothori commanders who were monitoring the battle from orbit because they had expected a quick victory followed by a mopping up operation, but instead, their forces were getting bogged down in brutal close-quarters combat. Sergeant Rachel Foster defended the water treatment facility with her squad, and when the Vothori breached the outer wall, she fell back to the secondary choke point and waited until the aliens were bunched together before triggering the plasma cutter that Marcus had jury-rigged into a devastating area denial weapon. The superheated plasma washed across the Vothori warriors, and their armor melted, and they screamed in languages the humans didn't understand, but the meaning was universal. All across the outpost, similar scenes played out as human defenders used their knowledge of the terrain and their willingness to die fighting to extract a terrible price from the invaders. Chen monitored the battle from multiple camera feeds and tactical displays, and she watched her people bleed and die, but she also watched them take down Vothori warriors at a rate that would make this invasion far more costly than Krex had ever imagined. Commander, we're taking casualties, but we're holding all critical sectors, Park reported, and his voice was tight with stress, but not fear. Acknowledged and prepared to execute fallback plan Delta. Chun responded because she knew they couldn't hold the surface positions forever. Marcus appeared at her elbow, and his face was streaked with soot, and his hands were dirty from crawling through access tunnels to make repairs under fire. The cave network is ready, Marcus said, and he pulled up a schematic on the nearest display, showing the extensive system of natural caves and artificial mining tunnels that honeycombed the rock beneath the outpost. "How many can we get underground?" China asked Stephen. Though she already knew the answer. "Everyone who's still fighting and all our critical equipment," Marcus replied, and he tapped the display to highlight the primary evacuation routes. The battle raged for 6 more hours, and the Vothri pushed deeper into the outpost, taking buildings and facilities that the humans appeared to be defending desperately. What Krex didn't realize was that Chen was conducting a fighting withdrawal, and every building the Vothri captured was either rigged to explode or had been stripped of anything valuable, and the real defensive line was underground, where the Vothri advantages in numbers and firepower would mean much less. Private Santos was one of the last to fall back, and she covered her squad's retreat with steady bursts from her machine gun until the barrel glowed red from sustained fire. "Last mag," she called out to her squad leader, who nodded and gestured toward the tunnel entrance that would take them deep into the cave system. Santos fired her final magazine at the advancing Vothri, and then grabbed the detonator that would collapse the tunnel entrance. And as she pressed the button and dove through the doorway, the ceiling came down behind her in a roar of falling rock throughout. The outpost's human defenders executed similar retreats, and soon the Vothri found themselves in control of a surface that was largely empty of enemies and filled with rubble and unexploded ordnance. "High Sentinel, we have secured the surface facilities," the ground commander reported, and his voice carried an edge of uncertainty that Krex found disturbing. "What are your casualties?" Krex demanded, and he already suspected the answer would displease him. "We have lost 400 warriors with another 200 wounded," the commander replied, and there was a long pause before he continued. "The humans fought with unexpected ferocity and skill," the commander added, and Krex could hear the confusion in his subordinate's voice. 400 dead. To capture a mining outpost filled with primitives who should have surrendered at the first sign of real resistance, and Krex felt anger building, because this was not how campaigns were supposed to proceed. Secure the underground facilities and eliminate any remaining resistance, Krex ordered harshly, and he cut the connection before his ground commander could respond. On the planet's surface, the Vothri warriors regrouped and tended their wounded and prepared to pursue the humans into the tunnels and caves where they had retreated. The senior Vothri officer on the ground was Commander Thax, and he had fought in 20 campaigns and conquered 15 worlds, but he had never encountered an enemy quite like these humans. They didn't fight like primitives, and they didn't panic when outmatched, and they seemed to view death in battle as an acceptable outcome rather than something to be avoided at all cost. Thax studied the tunnel entrances and noted the precision with which they had been collapsed, and he realized with growing unease that the humans had planned this retreat long before the battle began. "Move scouts into the accessible tunnels," Thax ordered, and he watched as teams of Vothri warriors cautiously entered the underground network. What happened next would haunt Thax for the rest of his short life, because the humans had turned the caves and tunnels into a nightmare maze of ambush points and death traps. The first scout team advanced 50 meters into a tunnel before the walls exploded outward and buried them under tons of rock, and the second team made it twice as far before automated turrets opened fire from concealed positions. By nightfall, the Vothri had lost another 100 warriors just attempting to map the underground network, and they had killed exactly 0 humans in return deep in the command bunker. Chun listened to reports from her squad leaders and allowed herself a. The dust swirled across the red surface of Kessler 9 as another mining truck rumbled past the main gates of Outpost Sentinel 7. Its cargo bay filled with rare minerals that would keep Earth's factories running for months to come, and Commander Sarah Chun watched from the observation deck as her people went about their daily routines with the kind of efficiency that came from years of frontier living. 847 souls called this remote colony home, and most of them were miners and scientists who had signed up for 5-year contracts with promises of good pay and adventure. But what they got was hard work in an unforgiving environment, where equipment broke down constantly and supply ships arrived late more often. The Na-Chun had been running this outpost for 3 years now, and she knew every person by name and knew their strengths and their weaknesses, and knew that despite their complaints about the food and the recycled air and the isolation from Earth, they were tough people who had chosen this life because they wanted to build something new. The security team numbered only 63 personnel, but Chun had made sure every single colonist knew how to handle weapons and how to follow emergency protocols, because out here on the frontier, you never knew when pirates or raiders might show up looking for easy pickings. Marcus Webb walked into the command center carrying a datapad and frowning at whatever information it displayed, and he was the chief engineer and the man who somehow kept their aging equipment functioning long past its intended lifespan through sheer stubbornness and creative problem-solving. "Commander, we've got another coolant leak in reactor 2, Marcus said without preamble, because he never wasted words when there was work to be done. "Can you patch it?" Chun asked while reviewing the daily reports from the mining operations. "Already did, but we're using components that should have been replaced 6 months ago," Marcus replied, and his tone suggested this was a conversation they had at least once a week, added to the list for the next supply run. Chun said, and they both knew the supply ship was already 2 weeks overdue, which meant it would probably be another month before it arrived. The morning passed like any other, with minor emergencies and equipment failures, and the constant background hum of industrial machinery that never quite stopped. And Chun was reviewing personnel schedules when the long-range sensor operator called out with unusual urgency in his voice. "Commander, I'm picking up 3 large contacts entering the system," the young man said, and his hands were already moving across his console to refine the sensor data. Chen felt her stomach tighten, because 3 ships traveling together meant this wasn't a random encounter, and she moved to the sensor station to see for herself what they were dealing with. The contacts were big, and they were moving with purpose directly toward Kessler 9, and their engine signatures didn't match any human vessel in the database, which meant only one thing, and Chun's mind immediately shifted from routine operations to combat readiness. "Sound General Alert," Chun ordered, and the klaxons began wailing throughout the outpost, and within minutes, her security chief, Lieutenant James Park, burst into the command center already pulling on his tactical vest. "What have we got?" Park asked while checking his sidearm with practiced efficiency. 3 unknown vessels inbound, and they're not human," Chun replied, and she was already pulling up the outpost's defensive protocols on her command terminal. The ships continued their approach, and when they reached communication range, a message came through on all frequencies, and the translation software worked for a moment before displaying the text on every screen in the command center. The message was simple and brutal, and it came from something calling itself High Sentinel Krex of the Vothari Collective, and it informed the humans that they had 12 hours to evacuate Kessler 9 or face extermination, because the Vothari had claimed this world for their own use. Shin read the message twice and felt anger building in her chest, because these aliens had just threatened her people and her home, and they clearly expected the humans to simply run away like frightened children. "Get me a channel to their command ship," Chun ordered, and when the connection was established, she spoke clearly and calmly. "This is Commander Sarah Chun of Earth Colony, Sentinel 7, and we have inhabited this world legally under recognized territorial laws, and we request additional time to verify your claims and establish diplomatic protocols." The response came quickly, and it was laced with contempt as High Sentinel Krex's voice echoed through the speakers, and his words made it clear he considered humans to be primitives who should be grateful he was offering them a chance to flee. "You have 12 hours, human, and if you remain, you will be eliminated," Krex said, and then the channel closed without allowing further Discussion Chun looked around the command center at her officers and saw determination on their faces instead of fear, and she knew in that moment they would not be running anywhere. "Marcus, I need every defensive system we have online within 6 hours," Chun said, and the engineer nodded and was already heading for the door. "Park, get every squad leader assembled in conference. Room 2 in 15 minutes. Chun continued, and the security chief acknowledged and started making calls. "Everyone else start evacuation protocols for non-essential personnel to the deep bunkers," Chun ordered, and the command staff jumped into action. What the Vothari didn't know, and what Chun was counting on, was that Outpost. Sentinel-7 wasn't just a mining colony, and it had been built with the hard lessons of humanity's expansion into space firmly in mind. Every colonist had military training because Earth's colonial charter required it after the Titan Station massacre 40 years ago, and the Outpost infrastructure included hardened bunkers and hidden weapon emplacements and a network of underground tunnels that connected every major facility. Marcus had also been working on a secret project for the past year and using salvage technology from an alien vessel that had crashed in the southern mountains, and Chun had authorized the research because she believed in being prepared for any eventuality. As the 12-hour countdown began, the Outpost transformed from a sleepy mining operation into a fortress, and civilians moved to their designated stations with calm efficiency, while security teams distributed weapons and ammunition. Chun stood on the observation deck one last time before heading to the command bunker, and she watched the 3 Vothari warships take up positions in orbit like vultures circling their prey. "They think we're easy prey," Lieutenant Park said quietly as he joined her at the window. "Let them think that for now," Chun replied, and her voice was hard as the minerals they pulled from Kessler 9's depths. "When do we show them what humans are really capable of?" Park asked. "When they commit to the attack, and when they've moved too close to retreat," Chun said, and she turned away from the window to face her security chief. "We're going to make them regret ever hearing about humanity," she continued, and Park smiled grimly because he knew the commander meant every word. The hours ticked down, and the Vothari ships maintained their positions, and High Sentinel Craig sent no further communications because he had made his ultimatum and expected compliance. But the humans weren't complying, and they were preparing, and they were turning their home into a killing ground because that's what humans did when threatened, and they didn't surrender. And they didn't run, and they fought with everything they had. When the 12-hour deadline passed, Craig's waited 1 additional hour, perhaps expecting the humans to crack under pressure, and when no evacuation ships launched, he gave the order to begin the attack. First orbital bombardment started exactly 13 hours after the initial warning, and the Vothari warships opened fire on what their sensors identified as critical infrastructure and power generation facilities and command structures. The missiles struck with devastating force, and explosions bloomed across the outpost surface, and for a moment it seemed like the human colony was being obliterated under the assault. But deep in the command bunker, Chun watched the tactical displays and allowed herself a small smile because every target the Vothari had hit was either a decoy or an abandoned structure that had been rigged to explode spectacularly, while the real facilities remained hidden underground. "They're taking the bait," Marcus said from his engineering station where he monitored the outpost to actual critical systems, which were all safely buried beneath meters of rock and reinforced concrete. "Give them 30 minutes of fireworks, and then cut the decoy power signatures," Chun ordered, and her plan was working exactly as intended. Vothari were destroying empty buildings, while the humans and all their important equipment remained untouched, and when Krex realized he wasn't seeing secondary explosions or reactor meltdowns, he would have to commit ground forces to verify the Phi results, and that was exactly what Chun wanted, because in orbit the Vothari had all the advantages, but on the ground fighting in the tunnels and caves and mining facilities, the humans would show these aliens what happened when you threatened their The bombardment continued, and Chun waited patiently for the next phase because she knew it was coming, and when it did, the real battle would begin.